Big systems of power shape all our lives, yet most of us rarely see how these institutions work or how the public can influence them. The United Nations may seem distant, but it offers real tools for holding governments accountable. On today's episode of Pushback Talks, Fredrik and Leilani welcome Sam Freeman, Head of Research and Advocacy at The Shift, and Dominika Leitane, Legal Officer at Opportunity Green. Together, they've taken action by bringing the connected crises of housing and climate directly to the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. This important United Nations review process, happening once every 4 years, creates a chance for civil society to challenge governments on their human rights duties. Sam and Dominika take us behind the scenes of international accountability, showing how these systems are used to hold states accountable. This is Pushback Talks.
I'm Fredrik Curtin, and I'm the filmmaker.
And I'm Leilani Farha, and I'm the advocate.
And this is again the Resistance podcast, Pushback Talks. We've found out that pushback actually means something, doesn't it, Leilani?
Of course it does.
Yeah, we have to push back.
We do. We have no choice, especially at this point in our contemporary history.
It is kind of let's call it interesting what's going on in the world. I mean, you have your neighbor up there, the Americans. They seem to be, no, not them. I mean, the junta that is running the country now are like creating a lot of problems for you in Canada. We have another neighbor here called Russia, which is like killing a lot of people around and invading other countries. It's kind of threatening. I'm here in Malmö. We look out at the strait here between Denmark and Sweden. We can see the Russian warships passing by. So it's for real.
It's for real. One sweet, sad thing, I was in the U.S. recently, and people would ask me, well, where are you from? I would say Canada. And they would immediately apologize for the behavior of their government. Pretty interesting. And I was in a state that is considered a red state. It went red in the last election, voting for Trump. And still, people were really embarrassed by the treatment of their longtime neighbor, longtime ally, friends. I mean, Canada, and the U.S. were always back and forth over the border. I lived right on the border for many years. That's where I had my kids, down in a city called Windsor, right? My skyline was Detroit. Some of my best friends worked in the States. They drove every day. I've been calling it governance by hatred. That seems to me to be the motivation, hatred of people, certain people.
Yeah, and also they really want to be on control of the storytelling of everything. So they send out all these provocations. But it's kind of, can they win in the long run when they create so many enemies? What if all of us start to work together and see, oh, we have friends, we have values. Let's focus on what we can do together.
I think it's the only way.
Yeah, and maybe that's also what this podcast can do, is to bring up people who do stuff, bring up people who fight back. And we have two guests today who are fighting back. And interestingly enough, two young advocates who are taking the UK government to court in the UN. I'm just a filmmaker, so I can be sloppy. You cannot. But welcome to Pushback Talks, Dominika Leitane from Opportunity Green, based in London, and Sam Freeman, who we had before. And Sam is the head of Research and Advocacy at The Shift. This amazing organization founded by our friend and the co-host of this podcast, Leilani Farha. Leilani, say something beautiful about these two young advocates.
I am very excited that Sam and Dominika are joining us, taking up the reins of advocacy and going to the United Nations. Pretty cool.
It's pretty cool. And you can, of course, question if the UN has a role now when international law is kind of devaluated. But I think that law and an order has some kind of meaning. But tell us, what are you up to, Sam and Dominika? Tell us what is happening.
First and foremost, thanks for having us here. Very, very excited to be on the podcast. just to flag that the UN is, of course, not a court, which is important for us to distinguish between kind of legally binding jurisprudence that goes on in the court and the United Nations treaty bodies, which deal with the international human rights law order, however, whose concluding observations and other documents are not necessarily legally binding. Nevertheless, we did go to the UN, and the reason why we did is that there's a fundamental connection between two massive crises that are happening in the UK. And those two crises are the climate crisis and the housing crisis. And we believe, first and foremost, is that these two crises are connected because they have immense adverse effects on human rights, not only in the UK, but internationally. But let's just focus on the UK for now. However, what's really, really interesting is that these two crises have some solutions in which they overlap. One of the main solutions is increasing the energy efficiency of the building stock. The UK is quite notable in that it has one of the least energy efficient housing stocks in all of Europe. And this really contributes to the kind of housing crisis through issues such as fuel poverty, which affects marginalized communities a lot more than it does the rest of us, unfortunately. And it also contributes really, really adversely to climate change because, of course, houses that are less insulated release more greenhouse gas emissions. This is a problem that is focused on the housing sector. However, for example, the reason why we didn't take this matter to a court in the UK, among other reasons, is the fact that courts are reluctant to impose specific policy measures upon the UK. So, for example, if we take the UK's obligations to reach specific climate targets, the courts have been quite reluctant to impose measures in specific sectors. So, for example, they will say you need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but they won't say you need to specifically kind of improve the energy efficiency of housing necessarily. So we saw this kind of gap in sector-specific enforcement mechanisms, which is why we decided to engage with this kind of UN treaty body procedure. We also thought it was really, really great to see an area where the cause of climate change aligns so nicely with the just transition cause, because that's not necessarily always the case. Whereas in this situation, what's best for the environment and the climate is also what's best for vulnerable communities and human rights.
It's very interesting. And you're taking on the climate and housing, two really important things. Sam, can you explain for us who are not so legally educated as you two, or the three of you, what is the practice you're going? I have never gone to the UN with an issue. I've been there filming, but how do you go about this?
Yeah, for sure. So it's a pretty long process if you look at it in total. I mean, it started, I think, for the UK in 2022, and the process, maybe to go back even further, is that every 4 years, I think Leilani might know better than I do, countries come up for review, which means that the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which is the committee that was established by the UN to be the body that oversees...
Stop a little bit here.
Yep.
So a country is up to review how often, you do say?
I think every 4 years. Is that right, Dominika?
Every 4 or 5 years, I believe, yeah.
Correct. But they get delayed, just so you say.
Yes.
So it really ends up being more like every 7 years.
Yeah.
Okay. But then you can see, okay, the UK government is coming up. Now we're going to act. This is what we are doing.
Yes, exactly. So you know which countries are coming up. You can kind of see it in their schedule, and there's a whole process they go through where the country will submit a report for a particular date that will be considered by the committee, who will pose a list of questions to the country.
Hang on, I want to know how you and Dominika, did you meet in the bar? Well, did you have a drink?
We met.
How did you come up with this kind of?
I wish.
We're going to go after the UK government.
Wow, we met at an event in, was it Leuven, in Dominika?
Yes.
In Belgium. We met at an event in Belgium.
So there was a bar.
And there might have been drinks involved, actually, but I can't remember. The shift had been kind of planning to engage more heavily with these processes and was kind of feeling it out a little bit. And then I met Dominika at this event, and we got talking about the fact that Opportunity Green was already engaged in this process on the UK. They'd already been thinking about their submission, I think they joined a bit of a coalition or a kind of party to a coalition. And obviously, I asked Dominika if we could take part because we obviously have that background in this area. We know the UN system very well. We know international human rights law very well. So I hope that we'd be able to contribute something decent to a submission that was being made. Dominika and Opportunity Green were very graciously accepted. And yeah, we went from there.
And Leilani, what did you say?
Yay! I mean, I was wanting the shift to move toward using the UN system for this very purpose. This body is made up of independent experts, so it's not government reviewing government. It's independent experts reviewing governments and holding them accountable to the treaties that they've signed and ratified. It is really the only body to do that in a meaningful way around the right to housing, for example. And now we're seeing them move right into the area of climate change as it affects social and economic rights. So I was very gung-ho, let's say, and super grateful that Opportunity Green was so open to working with us. And I know a couple people on that committee because of my UN days. And so it was a really nice fit. I would like to have the conversation about what is legally binding, what's not. Is this a court? Is this not a court? It's not a court in any formal sense. But maybe Sam and Dominika can tell us a little bit about what it's like when you actually are trying to hold the government accountable. Because you went off to Geneva, right? You were in a room, presumably with the government.
Tell us, details.
Yeah.
Is it men and women, or it's only guys? Do they have suit, or how are they dressed? It's like,
Was it formal, informal?
is it formal? Yeah. Do they like you, or?
There's a lot to report on that front. We were there for a couple of days. Sam, I think it was 3 days in total that the review took place. So day one was the meeting between certain committee members and the civil society organizations. And days 2 and 3 were the days of actual review. I must say, kind of a little disclaimer, I'm quite junior in my career. I was at the UN for the first time. I was freaking out. I was having the time of my life. I was just reflecting about how, I was doing my master's degree a couple of years ago, learning about the UN, and now I was there. So I might have quite a rosy-eyed perspective of it all, and I do apologize for that.
No, that's nice. I like that.
I love it.
I must say I had a great time.
I believe that the UN is more important than ever. So it's also good to have a nice view of being in the UN and think, okay, this body means something, has meant something, and will mean something again. And Sam, who are the guys you're meeting up with?
The committee members, there's committee members from all around the world. As Dominika said on the first day, it was kind of a smaller selection of them. So the country rapporteur, who's from Thailand, and then there's committee members from Argentina, I think India. And they gather in just quite a small, intimate room to hear from civil society. You each get an opportunity to put a statement, an oral statement to them. It's very short. I think we had 1.5 minutes each, Dominika, to put this oral statement. So you have to do it quite slowly because obviously you want to make your point, but also I think there's translation. So it's a lot to get through. It was I think it was a record-breaking review. I don't think they'd ever received as many submissions from civil society about a country before. So there was a lot of organisations in the room. They had to have 2 civil society sessions in the end.
Is this a new strategy from NGOs that kind of to use the legal way to raise important issues? Are you a part of a bigger trend of something, or?
I don't think it's a new strategy. The committee process has been used by NGOs for a long time to engage with governments kind of directly and put issues to governments directly. But I think there's maybe a bit more organisation around economic, social and cultural rights now, particularly in the UK, where we have an odd relationship with human rights in the sense of we have the Human Rights Act, which incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights into domestic law, but that's all civil and political rights. So when people mention human rights in the UK, domestically in the UK, it's automatically just considered to be civil and political rights rather than economic, social and cultural rights. And that's changing a bit. I think people, particularly with kind of economic troubles that we've had recently and cost of living crises, and people are becoming more wise to the fact that they have this whole other tranche of rights that they can rely on and should rely on, and the government should be realising for them. And they've identified this committee and the UN as the vehicle to put those concerns forward.
Sorry, if I may just come in and add to that, I think civil society as a whole is quite engaged in the United Kingdom. Part of that, unfortunately, is the reality that in the UK, engagement with civil society is a lot less likely to be followed by kind of repercussions. Whereas in other states, we might see kind of political persecution and those sorts of issues, which is why the UK, along with other kind of westernized states, have always had this kind of more active NGO and civil society community.
Yeah.
I'm curious to see, I mean, you meet this UN committee, but then you have people representing the UK government in the room. So do they love you, or are they say, oh God, don't bring us more work?
Well, they're actively quite deferential to you. Well, you don't ever meet the delegation, so civil society wouldn't have a direct conversation with the delegation. But we are obviously in the room when they're being reviewed by the committee, and they say lovely things about how glad they are to see so many civil society organisations there in the room.
Oh, I think that's interesting, because the way in which I first engaged the UN system, well before I became UN rapporteur, was through the committee, through this very committee that Sam and Dominika attended. I worked with both Canadian NGOs holding the government of Canada accountable, but also many other NGOs from different countries. And in many instances, the only time civil society was ever able to meet with government was in Geneva through that process. In other words, if they were back home and wrote a letter saying, I'd like to meet with the Ministry of whatever, Housing or Foreign Affairs, they would get no answer. But there they were in the room with government delegates and could actually interact with them in ways that they couldn't back home, which I always found so interesting. And it was, in fact, how I first started meeting government officials in Canada, was in Geneva, oddly. So it's interesting to me that you actually didn't have that interaction with your own government in Geneva, which is maybe the imperialist, you're dealing with the empire, let's face it. So one of the empires.
Maybe there would have been opportunities, but the way they set the room up, it's a very, very large room, like a long kind of rectangular shaped room. And civil society sit at the very back on tables facing the entire room. And the head of the delegation and the head of the committee, it's on a raised table at the front of the room. And then the delegation from the UK sit on a central table, and then the committee members sit on tables around the outside. So they're kind of boxed in by the committee members. So it's hard to kind of get to them to have those conversations. You'd have to probably walk over a committee member's desk in order to try and get someone from the Department of Energy or them.
Can you just describe, like, if it was it's like an oral hearing of some sort, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, it starts with the government giving a statement, an opening statement. It then moves on to the country rapporteur, who's just one of the committee members who's been appointed to kind of lead this process with the particular country. He gave a statement, and then they break the covenant down into sections, so covering different rights. So then there'll be a committee member who's in charge of each section, and they will initially pose questions to the country, and then the country will almost immediately respond. I mean, they don't get time to go back and think about their answers. They have to respond straight away. So.
Now I want to fast forward a bit, because I understand you got some kind of response already. You did well. Tell us.
We did incredibly well. I mean, it's hard to think of anything else that we would have wanted from this procedure. And it was evident from the review itself. We were we were really delighted to see that the committee, after both of our oral and written submissions, the committee was already asking the UK government repeated questions specifically about the housing sector, and specifically about kind of decarbonizing the housing sector and what was being done to kind of raise more money for it, and fuel poverty and financialization and all of those issues. So it was really great to see. And in fact, I believe it was someone from the Equality and Human Rights Commission in the UK who kind of came up to me after, because they knew what we were going to submit on. And they said, oh, well, you must be really happy because they basically covered everything you wanted. And I was like, yeah, I couldn't hide it. It was great. So from then, it was already clear that we had succeeded in kind of putting it on the committee's agenda, which was really great. And just the other day, in fact, I think just yesterday, right?
Yes,
the committee has released its kind of concluding observations, which is a written document that sets out the committee's recommendations to the UK of things that they can do to improve the human rights situation. And the committee kind of leaned very heavily towards decarbonising housing, as well as all of these other issues that we've considered. So it was great.
So your country will now start to do better, Sam. Then you can feel that I made a difference.
I hope it will make a difference. It's tough. I mean, what it enables us to do is have a written document there in black and white that we can use to put pressure on the government. We can say, you have been told by the most important committee at the UN covering these rights that this is what you need to do. There's no avoiding it anymore. Their recommendations are incredibly clear. So you need to do this now. And we can now, as civil society, both at Shift and other civil society organisations, start kind of putting pressure on the government to make these changes, but also start working with them where we can to help them make these changes. You know, these are big things they need to do. They need everybody on board doing them. Civil society, I'm not necessarily saying this is the Shift. I'm not going to blow our own trumpet that way, but so many organisations that make up civil society are unbelievable experts in how you make these changes, how you implement economic, social and cultural rights across society in the UK. So the government needs to work with us and others to implement these recommendations.
Leilani, I think this is really inspirational. I guess you can see yourself in these two young advocates once upon a time when you started up in the UN world. And hopefully this podcast also can spread this energy that resistance is important and you can make a difference even if you have a fascist gang sitting in the Oval Room and insulting people. We can still do stuff. Leilani?
Yeah, I think it was so important that the Shift and Opportunity Green did this at this moment. As I said, I really believe, like you, Fredrik, that we need some kind of international order. And right now what we have is a set of human rights that have been universally agreed upon by pretty much all states. And the only way for that order to take hold is if we keep saying there is a legal order. These are human rights. You've signed them in as law, and really breathe life into the processes that exist to hold governments accountable. And that's what Sam and Dominika did so effectively. So, I'm really excited. The Shift actually had a strategic meeting, a meeting to sort of think, what do we do now in this new world order where everything is chaos? And we actually took a decision that we were going to go back to basics and put the feet of government to the fire and hold them accountable to the human rights they claim to uphold. And so I was so excited that Dominika and Sam went ahead. I have a question for Sam. Was there a recommendation that came out of the committee that you were particularly pleased about and particularly surprised about?
I think there was, because I was jumping for joy after I read it yesterday. Yes, I mean, in the United Kingdom, we have the investment vehicle, real estate investment trusts, and they have been legal in the UK since 2007, and they are a mechanism a lot of investors use to buy housing and run housing and generate profit from housing. And they are not taxed fairly. They are exempt from corporate and income tax on their profits. They have to do a 20% withholding tax, but they're exempt from corporate and income tax on their profits. And as far as I can tell, I've dug back over the concluding observations of the committee since 2007, and I can't see they've ever made this recommendation before, but they made a recommendation that the UK should carry out an assessment of the economic and social impacts that result from this tax treatment of real estate investment trusts. So it's huge. I mean, this is something that we pushed for both in our written submission and oral submission, and in advocacy we did with committee members during the session. And it's something that other countries have done. Canada did such an assessment and found out they would make considerable savings, net savings, if they taxed real estate investment trusts fairly. So, yeah, delighted with that one. I think it has the potential to be very groundbreaking in terms of our advocacy in the UK and forcing the UK to take a position where it generates additional resources in line with its human rights obligations to realise economic, social and cultural rights.
Do you think there is an historic moment right now to actually make the UK government to move? Because, I mean, first of all, you have a Labour government, more progressive, we hope, but also now in this kind of the new world order, where Europe are more on its own. And maybe you have to show clearer to the world that we actually are rights-based. What we do is actually respecting international law and so on. Do you think you can use that moment?
Sure, yeah. I think what is great about the UK, for all of its flaws, is that the UK respects rule of law. At least it does so more than some other states. Rule of law is something that sets the UK apart. That's why kind of legal services in this country are so renowned and so widely used. And I think that does provide a really, really great platform for us to emphasize anything that has to do with kind of legal obligations and human rights obligations. As mentioned, we do have a new government in power for the first time in more than a decade. So it does feel like there is this kind of opportunity to make a change now in this moment and to kind of emphasize our commitment to, once again, the rule of law, human rights, decarbonization, improving the housing stock. Yeah, exciting.
Exciting and good news for all of us, because we are kind of in need of good news and good energy. So it's really cool to have both of you on our podcast. And so what would you send on to other listeners of this podcast that say, okay, I also would like to go and engage myself? Sam and Dominika, have you any good words to young people who are maybe at university now and are looking for their way in life?
I would say just go for it. Just look for opportunities, particularly for people who are at university. I know that universities are quite nourishing environments where there are clubs, there are societies, there are events, there are loads of opportunities to get involved. That's how I started my journey towards this kind of career that I now lead and that I'm very, very happy with. You start small, and I'm sure that for people who are in very early stages of their career or their education, it might seem like it's really impossible to imagine that kind of stage in your life where you will be able to make a change and you will be able to have tangible impact. But it's literally just you build it step by step. You do whatever you can do now, even if it's literally just like sign up for, I don't know, a class on whatever it is that you're passionate about. You might think it's nothing now, but it will lead to further opportunities down the line. For example, when I was doing my master's degree, I did a research project, which was part of my degree, which was the only reason why I even knew what the Committee on Economic and Social and Cultural Rights was, is because of that project that I did. And several years down the line, I was able to apply that knowledge in this amazing way with the shift. So I just say, go for it. Go for it. Just do it.
I would obviously agree. I think Leilani knows that I got my break during my master's through her. So Leilani, I think I've probably maybe mentioned on the podcast before, but I ended up being convinced to do a directed research project by a professor I had when I was doing my master's at the University of Ottawa. And that research project was to help Leilani on one of her reports when she's special rapporteur. I nearly didn't do it. I don't know if I've told you that, Leilani. I very nearly didn't do it because I was so anxious at the time that I was like, I can't take on another thing. But I eventually thought, oh, this is too big of an opportunity to pass up. And yeah. I don't think I've stopped working for you since. So I did a little stint somewhere else in the UN, but I always came back to doing this work. So I completely agree. Take opportunities. For me, don't be put off by feeling like you don't have the knowledge of human rights, the knowledge of, if you care, the knowledge will follow from you giving a shit about people and about communities and about the planet and about equality and outcomes and equity. It'll flow from that. So yeah, just immerse yourself in the world, and as Dominika said, take the opportunities that are on the table in front of you.
Yeah.
Sorry for swearing as well. I don't know. I've realised I don't know if I'm allowed to swear.
No, we like it. That's all part of the resistance.
This is a juicy podcast. No worries, Leilani.
Yeah, but I love what both of you said, Sam and Dominika, because what you're saying is, pursue the issues you care about, find the opportunities, rather than be ambitious. And I think it's funny because I'm about to give a speech to young people in Vancouver, students, about human rights and how to get there and how to do it. And that's one of the messages I want to convey. I didn't become UN rapporteur because I was ambitious. I became UN rapporteur because I cared deeply about housing and worked to try to make the world a better place for people who have shitty housing, basically. Swearing too. So I really loved what you said. And I am really trying to invest in young people right now because obviously, young people are our future, but also you all have more energy than we old folk, right, Fredrik? We're getting tired.
No,
not us.
Talk for yourself.
Yeah, well, I am getting tired, and I feel like we need the energy of young people and your wisdom and your ability to see a better future and demand one.
Yeah, and your anger, of course. I can say that when I'm out with my last film, Breaking Social, or maybe with any film I'm out with, but especially with Breaking Social, a lot of people come up to me and ask, what can I do? I would like to be active. Where should I go? And that's something I would like to send on. Use documentary films in your clubs or in your meetings in your NGOs. Because the energy of the film and the conversations after is actually also bringing up this kind of emotions that you need to take on these big challenges.
Oh, I so agree with that. I think also right now the power of documentary film is really being felt around the world. We see the recent win at the Oscars of No Other Land, this Palestinian-Israeli film, and it's provoked so many conversations, really interesting and deep conversations around Zionism and liberal Zionism and the plight of Palestinians who are being ethnically cleansed and deported, etc. So, and of course, my experience through Push the Film, it has changed conversations. I have no doubt about that. It has ignited conversations and it's changed the way governments are dealing with housing, I feel.
And Breaking Social is about a kleptocratic network buying elections. So it's kind of timely. So if anybody would like to use the film, just contact us and we'll find a way to organize screenings or so on. I really would like that to happen now. I'm a bit frustrated that we have so many progressive friends, but everybody in NGOs are busy with their own internal life, so they don't have time to be solidarian with filmmakers or whatever.
Yes.
I think that should change because films also bring people together. And sometimes it's good to sit in a room together.
I think we have no choice right now. I think those of us who share values all across continents and divides, we have to come together to assert our vision of the world against those who have a lot of power and are really ruining the world, in my opinion.
Yeah, and openly evil people also.
Yes.
Not even being embarrassed of being so evil.
Yes.
Friends, lovely to meet you. And I want to follow up. I mean, I think there should be some maybe sign of the houses somewhere in London or in the UK where change made thanks to Sam and Dominika somewhere.
I love it. Yeah, but the work begins, right, Sam and Dominika? Now you'll take these wrecks and move them. That's the real work. That's the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
And you had a number you wanted to share with us before we close, Leilani.
Yeah, someone sent me the latest available data from Savills about the financialization of housing, and the global value of residential real estate has now reached almost $290 trillion. And even where there's been like dips in value, overall over the last 3 years, it has seen the most significant increase of all commodities, assets, I think next to gold.
So our homes are still the most attractive commodity on the market. And it means for us that it will be more expensive to live in those houses.
That's right.
And the shops will have to put a higher price on the food because they're also renting spaces. And then not talking about my coffee and the wine, will also be more expensive thanks to those investors. We don't like them. Anyway, is that a good way to round up? I can start to think about wine and coffee. Are you good?
It's early here still. I'm going to go the coffee route, not the wine route, but yeah, that's good.
Okay. So thank you very much, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And Leilani, how do we fund this podcast? Do we fund the podcast?
We don't fund the podcast. Folks out there listening to us, we need you to fund the podcast. We do not accept advertisements, but if you go to patreon.com and look for Pushback Talks, you can support us. You can give us a few euros, a few pounds, a few dollars, a few lira, whatever your currency. Share the love.
And you can also rate the podcast, and you can make comments wherever you listen to the podcast. That actually helps us a lot. And you can, of course, always recommend it and share our social media. Small things, but if you have mighty enemies, you need many friends. So be a friend. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Thanks, Fredrik.
Bye.
Pushback Talks is produced by WG Film. To support the podcast, become a patron by going to patreon.com/pushbacktalks. Follow us on social media at make_the_shift and push_the_film. Or check out our websites, maketheshift.org, pushthefilm.com, or breakingsocialfilm.com.